mean, there's definitely interesting points about what I've read, and I'll try to highlight some of the things that I found interesting and think that there may be some relevancy to, you know, what we're going to be, what we're trying to think about in terms of electrification in rural parts and in non-rural parts where people don't have access right now. So I think one thing to start with is in many of the resources, there's a very, very pointed emphasis on the fact that the central government of China worked very closely with local governments, provincial governments, governments on the county level, and all the sort of structures of governance below that. And I think that partnership created a lot of possibilities and opportunities for what they were able to implement, and also on the local level, sort of gathering information to try to understand what would be possible in particular regions because of the specific conditions, whether of resources or terrain or social, political conditions locally that could help facilitate the electrification process. I think the other thing I just want to point out is that, you know, like sub-Saharan Africa, each of the countries and within countries, there's lots of diversity. There's diversity of conditions and what kinds of resources are accessible, including natural resources like water for hydro, or sun for solar, and wind for wind power, and infrastructure for other kinds of energy generation. And so, you know, I'm going to be talking generally, but those conditions make a difference in terms of how the planning of electrification takes place. So on the screen here, I just have one slide for this presentation, but it's a breakdown of basically 4 stages of the electrification process. So the first being the years from 1949 to 1977. Actually, I'm going to look on my screen. Where they talked about establishing a comprehensive management network vertically from the national level. And so I'll talk a little bit about what I learned from that period and, yeah, that first period of electrification. And then there's the second stage, which was from 1978 to 1997. And that's the central government transferring management of local electrical systems to local governments. So there's sort of a transfer of who's actually administering the management. And then there's a third stage, 1998 to 2002, where they actually started to promote commercial operation of the utility market, and they were trying to create a competitive electricity market. And then I don't have much data between 2002 and 2012, but from 2012 to 2015, they managed to electrify the last 3% of China's most remote rural areas and achieve 100% electrification by 2015. So that's more or less how it's going to be broken down. Okay, so in the first stage, in that early period, you know, China was really without any kind of resources, and they didn't have the resource of capital or technology or management professionals, is what they called it, management professionals to actually promote and deal with rural electrification. And in those early stages, the consumption of electricity in rural China was less than 1% of the national total. And so through under very strict central planning, they were able to create access for a lot of people. And I'll just emphasize the idea of strict planning, because I think when we think about electrification, I think there's always a question of why are we electrifying, right? Who are we trying to benefit and for what purpose? And I think that question is pertinent to the debates around energy and electrification today, because there are groups of people within the climate movement that are engaged in energy debates that may not think that electrification is necessary, or that electrification may not be necessary to result in the integration of communities of people into modern day society and modern day life, and that perhaps people want electricity so they can charge up their mobile phones or have a few appliances in their home so that they can, or as you know, women are very impacted and most impacted by the conditions of energy poverty, and in the home, you know, to have electricity access, you can both reduce hazardous pollution in the air from cooking, but also you can liberate women's time in terms of not being tied to domestic work because they have access to electricity and what that offers. But I think there's always going to be a question of how far do we want to electrify, and for what end, and why? And in many of the things that I'm reading, you know, people obviously argue for electrification because it does help create productive economies that can be integrated into, you know, global economies, and can give people access to education institutions. It can, you know, increase health access and services. And there's a lot of, you know, basic human needs that can be improved by electricity. But I think one of the things for us to think about is, you know, to what extent do we want to electrify, and what does that mean? And in the case of China, I think China was very conscious of trying to plan so that they could improve and increase economic activity and have production of commodities that were that are high-level commodities that you know, can stimulate the economy. So there was a lot of planning on China's part around electrification in their thinking about their development plans to stimulate industrial economies, and also to stimulate agriculture, production, fishing, herding, other kinds of activities, as well as provide residential electricity. So I think they, in the, you know, several decades, 7 decades of electrification, of their electrification process, was continually thinking about programs and policies that would help advance those agendas in terms of industry, agriculture, and residential living. So in the first stage, China actually imported power technologies from the USSR, and so I just thought that was useful to bring in, because we talk about a global public goods framework in the framing document, and we've mentioned it in the Nairobi meeting and onward in terms of the public pathway. And we've also talked about, like, are there ways for you know, direct procurement of technologies, or exchanging skill training for workers, or other things that are different than the IMF, World Bank kinds of, you know, you're only trying to invest to accumulate profit, but that there are other ways of actually thinking about how we behave in terms of thinking about energy transition, and the case of China from, many decades ago, importing technology from the former USSR, I feel like fit into that. And are there other things, if we're thinking about the context of Africa, other ways that we can, that idea of, direct procurement of technologies or skill exchanges can be implemented when we think about the energy transition. So there were power projects developed back then in China, but not many of them were in the rural areas, and there was no specific national institution that actually managed and invested in rural electrification. So the central government wasn't trying to develop rural electrification as their first priority. But slowly they started to develop infrastructure and realized that there was a multi-year process to be able, that you would need to actually develop local infrastructure to actually be able to develop rural electrification. So in the late 50s, the government started to establish wholesale and retail power institutions at the county level so that the counties could potentially manage power supplies for the rural areas. And they started by doing a pilot project and some demonstrative models of that. And that was from the edict of the central government. The county level institutions were the ones that were actually responsible to then manage some of these smaller hydrothermal networks and some other types of rural power networks. And then in the 60s, the government actually really wanted to prioritize the connections, any connections to national grid for food production and irrigation and for grain production. But in the meantime, they also really tried to encourage rural networks to develop small hydropower plants. And so hydropower was a big, the effort to develop hydropower plants was definitely, they were trying to advance through the central government. They also established a policy called I think this is a direct translation, so it's self-construction, self-management, and self-consumption policy to try to mobilize construction resources on the local level. So really trying to get the local level to develop their own resources or pull their own resources to develop some of their own energy generation and then their own use of that generation. And then towards the end of the 70s, and through some economic planning, China established a much more comprehensive management network that vertically from the central level to the lower levels of the regions, the provinces, the prefectures, cities, to the counties. One of the, again, in the framework of planning, the central government was both trying to think about industrial development, but also wanting to ensure that there were no food shortages. And so they also thought about, electricity in the context of providing food. And so they had programs specifically to ensure that electricity was used for agricultural production. They also had a national policy called revenue from electricity for electricity. So I think to generate capital would take the revenue generated and then put it back into developing the infrastructure of the energy system. And with the state, with the central government that has that kind of power, you can do those kinds of things where the money goes back into developing out the electricity system. But even by the end of the 70s, it wasn't as though the rural electrification process was accelerating very quickly. Because there were still power shortages in the urban areas, it meant that the rural electrification project wasn't of utmost priority to get enough electricity generated for the urban areas was still prioritized over rural electrification. And at that point, it was mostly in the county and villages area, in the rural areas, it was still mostly hydropower in local stations. Okay, so by the late 70s, actually by 1979 specifically, there were 90,000 small hydro power stations built. And that was a total capacity of 6.33 gigawatts. But connections to major grids were still inefficient and had a lot of problems. So it wasn't like the rural areas were experiencing, access quickly or easily. And because there was, ultimately because there was not the kind of support still needed from a national system, therefore the rural areas were still struggling with consumption and access and consumption. So then in the second stage, when central government was transferring the management of the local electricity system to the local government, the central government was actually providing 80% funding for capital construction in rural areas to county governments. So there was a lot of federal funding coming through. And one of the key, mechanisms for stimulating revenue generation was because, 80% was coming from the central government, but 20% was coming from local governments. And how the local governments were generating that revenue was through township and village enterprises. And those enterprises, these small businesses, became very important in terms of poverty reduction and revenue generation in general. And in particular, those small businesses relied on coal and diesel power because they were more reliable than the local hydro. But with the generation of revenue from small businesses, there was a more demand on electricity, thereby sort of creating a loop or a cycle where there's more, you have more money in your pocket, and because of the businesses, there's more demand for electricity. You can spend more money to pay for electricity, and then more electricity, and then the demand for electricity goes up. So you create this sort of cycle of supply and demand that helped stimulate both the economy, but also the need for electricity in the more rural areas. In 1983, there was a document that was put forward by the state, and it was to really push forward the development of rural hydropower through their own initiative with their own capability. So really trying to make these local areas independent in terms of developing their power. And with that, local government, like in this period, local government was strengthened. And so the central government started to hand over administration of rural electrification to the local governments. In 1985, the central government also adjusted electricity tariffs to encourage local governments to build power plants. So they made it beneficial for local governments to actually build their own plants. And then in 1993, they separated the national tax from the local tax revenue, and this actually strengthened electricity construction capacity of the local government because they were no longer under the same, tax structure. And at that point, the central government was also pushing and developing electrification projects. Let's see. Okay, in this period of the development of small hydropower and rural grid construction, the central government decided to do a pilot of 100 counties for preliminary electrification. And in that process, there was a certain set of requirements that each county needed to meet in order to be seen as fulfilling access to electricity. And those requirements were 90% of the rural households had to have access of electricity for lighting, broadcasting, TV programs throughout the year, cooking, and also for irrigation, food processing, and township and village enterprises. So it was a very comprehensive list of things that needed to be met in order to consider that area with access to electricity. Okay, and by 2000, 334 counties were electrified in accordance to those national standards. A subsidy from the central government provided with that first 100 pilot counties was 13.8% of the total cost of the electrification process, and the rest came from the local governments. So the local government actually provided a lot of the funding. And then by the third round of these electrification efforts, there was over 300 pilot counties that were electrified, and it was a total of 4.07 billion renminbi, which is the currency in China. And of that total cost, 6.1% was provided by the central government, and then 6.4% was provided by provincial governments, and then funds collected by the county governments provided the 38.1% of the total cost, which is quite a fair amount. And then bank loans provided 49.9% of the total cost. I don't know what kind of bank loans, and I'm assuming it's the Central Bank of China, but I'm not clear on what that was, but that was the other half of how these areas got electrified in terms of financing. Okay. So by the last stages, the electrification rate was rapidly increasing. So, as we get closer and closer to 2002, electrification was happening more and more quickly because all these things had been set in place to build up the infrastructure through the planning process of the central government. The county unit, they identified in this one article that the county itself was the unit of government administration that was the most effective for planning and project implementation. I think both because they understood what was happening locally, what the conditions were, what the resources were, and what the social responses to electrification would be. And so, again, highlighting the importance of the relationship between the central government and the local governments, I think that point is important there. By 1996, there were 6,000 small hydro stations that had a total installed capacity of 19.2 terawatts. And let's see. Okay. So after the central government, sorry, this is stage 3 now. After the central government transferred the administration of the rural electricity system to local governments, what arose and what emerged was that there was a lot of political issues, and the business of power created many problems in rural electrification. So, for example, like local governments tried to collect fees on power, and what that resulted in was that people couldn't pay for their electricity because the costs with the fees were so expensive. And then there was a lot of technical problems with outdated equipment, poor supply quality, inefficiency with transmission lines. And so the central government decided to do something about that. And in that decision, they adopted an expansion of fiscal policy and also enlarged the input and construction of infrastructure. And so for the second half of 1998, there was a whole rural grid renovation program. And the purpose of that program was to unify tariffs for rural and urban areas. And they achieved this by reforming rural electricity management systems and renovating the rural grids. This ensured, and then they ensured that only one electricity supply company existed per county, so they kind of consolidated. And then they integrated the rural and the city electricity management to create a competitive, a more consolidated, competitive electricity market. Okay, so after the improvements with the renovations, the delivery was better, access was better, et cetera, et cetera. And so in that change, it meant that it just improved the access in the rural areas. And there was also, because of the tariff reductions now that new plants were developed and they had changed the tariff system, it meant that rural residents were actually saving in total billions of dollars per year on their electricity bills. And so there was a lot of rapid improvement in rural capacity and generation in that short amount of time. Moving on to the last stage, the last period to capture the last 3% of electrification, the central government put forward this plan called Electricity for All, and it was to reach the last 2.73 million people who hadn't had access. And again, I think the central government put in money, and depending on, it wasn't like a formula. They actually really tried to interrogate which provinces, which counties needed more funds to develop their electricity grids. And so the central government would invest the costs between 20 to 80% of the funds needed, and then the provinces would put in the additional money. In terms of implementing solar PV projects, it was private firms. They got to fund some of the solar PV projects. In that last 3%, it was extending the grid that helped give access, but because that was very expensive, they also relied on hydro and coal, but also on small solar PV systems to reach the most remote people. And they also implemented different kinds of plans, like infrastructure to every village project. And so they, provided power, roads, water, telecommunications that added to helping facilitate the need for electrification. And then they also had certain projects like home appliances to the countryside, where the central government would provide funding so that newly electrified regions, residents of those newly electrified areas could actually receive appliances so that they could then use the electricity that they were now connected to. And I think ultimately, because the central government can mobilize large amounts of capital easily, they can also bring together provincial governments and state-owned power companies, and can bring together local officials. It's been possible for China to electrify in the way that it has. And I think I'm going to stop there and hand it over to you, Andile.
Thanks, Comrade Irene, and thanks to all of the insights and contributions from comrades today. I think it's quite appropriate for this last session in terms of getting an idea of the energy landscape across the continent if we are going to consider the Chinese situation and ask if there are any lessons we can learn, and if a similar kind of electrification and socioeconomic development can be implemented here. And I should just say again, we're not experts, but we're trying to sort of stretch our imaginations. And what makes all of this difficult is to remember that our continent is huge. And the contexts are different from nation to nation, politically, economically, and even the commitment to neoliberalism across the African continent is something that diverges as well, which means that our approaches to a public pathway are going to depend on the specific scenarios we find ourselves in. So I sort of frame this, the big question I think we can ask ourselves when we look at the Chinese situation and their success at electrification is, how can the public sector in Africa be transformed and saved from the grip of neoliberalism in order to pursue electrification? And of course, how you answer that question depends on the various contexts you find yourselves within. But there are three very important things I think we need to recognize from the Chinese success story of electrification. The first one, of course, is that it's a very long process. We shouldn't expect the kind of politics we're pursuing to happen overnight. It took China basically half a century to be able to do what they did. Now, the second thing that's quite important is that China's electrification succeeded in part due to the capacity of the state to coordinate stakeholders and provide policy leadership, right? Secondly, electrification primarily functioned in China, as Irene has mentioned, as a facilitator of socio-economic development. So it wasn't merely about giving people access to electricity. It was about giving people access to electricity for better outcomes in terms of education, health, public safety, public pollution, and of course, economic participation. And finally then, we can observe that the Chinese state, in cooperation with its local government and its provincial governments, had a different ideological orientation in terms of what it prioritized in regards to electrification and just generally its economic policy in many instances. So these are the three things that we observe, just to hash them over again. Number one, the process of mass electrification is long. Number two, the Chinese state had built up the capacity and the political authority to coordinate and plan such an effort over many decades, also providing policy leadership. Number three, this electrification functioned to improve people's lives socioeconomically, which of course ends up making the process of electrification easier down the line. As Irene said, it's a process that feeds into each other. And then finally, the Chinese state had a different ideological orientation. And it's quite important to make that point when we live in a time where we're told that the state and public utilities must take a backseat when it comes to energy and just when it comes to socioeconomic issues overall. So if mass electrification is to be pursued in Africa along the similar model that China had, I think my observation then is that the neoliberal state needs to be challenged. And why do I say that? I think, again, it's important to remind ourselves what the function of neoliberal states are, right? They don't minimize themselves, but rather the neoliberal state works to create and preserve the institutional framework for capital accumulation and protecting the economic interests of elites. So, for example, in the South African context, this means giving Eskom the full cost recovery model. This means commodifying electricity, even if it leads to energy poverty. This means running public utilities as though they were private companies. So the state, in many instances across the continent, functions to facilitate capitalist accumulation, and that applies specifically with energy, as we've seen the recent excitement about leading a transition on a for-profit basis. Many of the states are being sort of pampered to get ready to be able to do that. So if there is an attempt to have a public pathway in Africa for mass electrification, then we need to begin challenging the neoliberal state and its different functions. And so then I think this brings us on to the question then of like financing, which is an incredibly difficult one. So firstly, there's the question of where are we going to get the money to pursue these kinds of massive public works, but also then, before we can even have a discussion of where the finances are going to come for mass electrification, there needs to be a challenge of the macroeconomic framework that states are using in terms of having a commitment to austerity, in terms of providing tax breaks for corporations, in terms of trying to enforce labor market flexibility. And all those kinds of policies are what we mean exactly by green structural adjustment. So the arrival of green energy on the African continent and in the South in general is not just an attempt to make profit, but it's an attempt to transform those economies. If we want to have a discussion about where the financing for mass electrification is going to come from, we need to understand the ways in which the current macroeconomic framework stands in the way of pursuing a public pathway to electrification. So I think there needs to be discussions about the kinds of campaigns, movements, coalitions that can be built to resist neoliberal economics before we even get to the point of where are we going to get the money to be able to do this. But then again, on the points of electrification and finance, there has been in recent times amongst the environmental movement, or at least the leftist environmental movement around the world, a need to challenge the global tax policy framework. So if we are going to pursue mass electrification, then there needs to be real movements which simply say that the transnational corporations and the ultra-rich who benefit greatly from Africa need to start paying the surplus. They need to start not keeping the surplus. We need to rework tax policies in such a way that we are able to have pools of resources that can be poured back into development in the same way that the Chinese state was able to generate revenue in certain instances and pour it back towards development. What you see often now with power utilities across the continent is the obligation to produce revenue, but then that revenue not going precisely back into the kinds of critical maintenance that are needed in order for power stations to actually provide the public with the goods that they precisely need. And another point then, when it comes to the kinds of economic policies that need to be challenged, once again, if we are going to pursue a public pathway to mass electrification, I think Brian Kamanzi mentioned this before, is that we need to confront the extractive nature of the economy in Africa for the most part. In other words, that I think labor movements need to be reinvigorated in their resistance to extractivism, because that kind of extractivism positions Africa in such a way that we are dependent on the sort of the economy built in the north, but also it is a kind of extractivism which doesn't develop us locally as well. And I think that if electrification is a means to socioeconomic development, it cannot occur in such an extractive economy across the globe. But confronting that extractive economy, which weakens Africa's positions relative to countries in the north, also then means we have to confront the legislative frameworks which allow extraction to happen in the first instance. So comrades, as you can see, the pursuit of mass electrification is really a confrontation with all the different pieces that have made neoliberalism work across the continent. Then there's another question of, if we want to build a public sector that has the capacity, the political interests, and the orientation to pursue mass electrification, there needs to be a discussion about the internal culture of governance within the states that might lead this effort. So one of the calls that we have made in South Africa for Eskom, for example, is that if it's going to be a publicly owned utility, it must truly function on a democratic basis. And I think the Chinese example kind of proves this, because local governments and provincial governments were crucial in the sense that they went out into the communities that they were governing and they looked at the various conditions and they were able to formulate their responses to those conditions. And I think we can deepen that process as well in terms of mass electrification. So there needs to be a discussion about how can the culture within governments be exposed to democratic impulses from the people when it comes to electrification. And again, this is another point about governance, and this is what makes it difficult in the African context, is the internal politics within different regions. So for example, in South Africa, a huge obstacle to socioeconomic development has not just been transnational corporations, but it's often been traditional leadership, which own a huge amount of lands across the country, which are willing to cooperate with transnational corporations and sell out their communities and their lands in the name of one-sided and uneven development. So the kinds of movements that we're going to build in our regions have to understand the dynamics in those specific regions as well, whether it's traditional leaders, whether it is bureaucrats, whether it is community leaders, and so on and so on. So I think there needs to be a realism about the kinds of governance cultures that occur within different African states and how they can be transformed and how they can be confronted as well. And then finally, I think there's an important discussion about labor in terms of pursuing mass electrification. So what we know is that the World Bank, the International Partners Group, what they want with this just transition is precarious labor. They want labor to be easily exploitable. They want labor to be cheap, which means no benefits, which means low pay, which means working on a casual basis, which means being very vulnerable to your employer. So if we are going to pursue these kinds of mass electrification across the continent, which is going to require upskilling, which is going to require a lot of public education drives and efforts as well, how can we coordinate with different labor movements to ensure that the rights of workers are protected and maintained, to ensure that workers don't become disposable in this process of mass electrification as well? And then finally, I think this is, and I hope I'm not sounding like I'm giving too much of the South African context, but I think it is a prevalent problem across the continent. We need to then reckon with the economy of corruption that is built across the continent. Now, often the issue of corruption is presented in the news as kind of like a moral issue, a moral failing, but it's not really. It's a political economy. It has become a way in which many governments do politics and build careers. And when people resist that in the name of public goods, public services, social protection, often the resistance from elites who conduct that kind of parasitic corruption is violent and oppressive. So there also needs to be a discussion that if we are going to go to our communities and nations and say that we want to reclaim the public sector to electrify people, how do we then answer them when they question the fact that governments have incapacitated themselves in many ways through this economy of corruption? We need to find political answers to the question of corruption beyond just legal defenses and hoping the courts are going to sort it out. And one of the ways in which you do that, I think, is, and the ESCOM situation proves this, is ending outsourcing. So, you know, outsourcing across the world, in fact, has become a way in which business elites and political elites can collude, misappropriate funds, and misdirect the priorities of institutions away from the public good. So again, I think it's about finding the mechanisms through which things like corruption work and finding a way to sort of stop the tap before it even starts running. But I think if there's still time, perhaps you could have discussion. But yeah, thanks, comrades. Thanks, comrades, for quite a lively discussion at the end of the day, and a lot of difficult issues to figure out as well. So just a few responses. I think, firstly, the tension that was raised between the reality of climate change and the climate crisis and the need for socioeconomic development in the South to improve people's well-being. I think it is a tension that, I think perhaps the gravity of this tension at times is exacerbated and intensified. I think pursuing development through a transition, through a public pathway, opens up opportunities for socioeconomic development. So the kinds of technologies, infrastructure, and skills that you're going to need in order to be able to build the kind of decarbonized economies that you want, open up the opportunity for people to be able to have dignified, well-paying jobs. So I think the idea that we cannot protect the climate that in the protection of the climate we have to sacrifice socioeconomic development, I simply don't think that it's true. I think that is often a way for private actors to be able to try and take the reins. I think research has been done by a variety of organizations, such as AIDZ, to demonstrate that this public pathway to a transition is possible in terms of leading to better socioeconomic outcomes, because it is going to require a lot of manpower. It is going to require a lot of coordination and resources led by the public sector. And then, of course, there's the concern about debt and the kind of restraints that debt puts on countries within the global south. I think firstly we have to acknowledge that that is at first a political problem with political leadership in the global south. If there's going to be a campaign to cancel debt, to resist these kinds of debt traps, it is our obligation then to build the kinds of movements and the kinds of political leverage to resist that from our leadership before we then even can get to the point of the World Bank and the IMF. Because often that's where it initially begins, essentially our leaders selling us out. And I think the work perhaps hasn't been quick enough in coordination with different countries across the regions. So there needs to be a way in which we can coordinate across different regions in the global south to be able to resist the debt traps internally that our leaders put us into, and then begin tackling the bigger players such as the World Bank and the IMF. And I am not exactly sure the kinds of leverage you can build to be able to really resist powerful financial institutions. And perhaps that's a discussion we can have throughout this week. Like, what kinds of organizing are really necessary to be able to take on such a massive effort like canceling debt from the World Bank, for example. So I think there's a discussion to be had about the kinds of tactics we can deploy in that pursuit. And of course, there's the very important question that was raised about the authoritarian character of the Chinese state when it was pursuing mass electrification. And once again, I think big kinds of socioeconomic development led by the public states do not have to dive into, authoritative politics. I think that is up to us again to build internal cultures of democracy when we are trying to pursue these big public works. And one of the ways in which you can do that, I think, is demonstrating to working class, unemployed, and poor people that you are able to directly benefit from these kinds of initiatives, to demonstrate that it is within your material interests to take this public pathway. And one of the ways in which we do that is by getting victories as the working class, as the unemployed, and as those who are precarious. We have to get democratic buy-in from people and not rely on coercive measures. And I don't think any of us want to do that. But I think there needs to be an emphasis on the fact of demonstrating to working people that yes, there are alternatives, you are able to benefit from them, and through that I think you're able to get democratic buy-in. I think historically it's been done before with the kinds of development you saw in the North in the early 20th century as well. People were able to directly benefit from public works and were able to put themselves into it and even defend instances when those kinds of public works were attacked by the private sector. So I think again, as Sean said, it's not about trying to imitate China necessarily, but trying to see what kinds of things can be learned from China and where it can be improved upon as well. Let's see, what else is left? And yes, I think, the point about neocolonialism is quite important. I mean, where you see the biggest struggles against multinational corporations are often in instances where communities have had historic experiences of being dispossessed, of being exploited. And I think it is important to bring that up in our framing. And I think it also connects with people's experiences with groups such as the Amadiba Crisis Committee, for example, with groups in Paraguay and in many parts of South America as well. I think the struggle of indigenous people is the struggle of working class people throughout the past 400 or 500 years. It's the struggle against those who want to dispossess and exploit. So I think it's important that we make those kinds of connections as well, and perhaps avoid language that obscures the real nature of the issue. I think ultimately from my side then, before Irene responds, the question of mass electrification is really a question of what do we want our public sector to look like? Do we want it to be a public sector that prioritizes the well-being of people, that does it through sustainable financing, that has the capacity to resist international finance institutions and domestic and transnational capital as well? It's a huge task to pursue, but if we want to undo the past 50 years of the public sector being devoured, then we need to start reimagining it on a very democratic basis, in touch with the restraints that we have as it is presently anyways. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Comrade Andile. So unlike all of you, I am a bit brain dead. I know everybody here is raising really excellent points, and I think I mean, this kind of discussion is exciting and inspiring, and I think that's what we're hoping to take into the next few days. I think the challenge to neoliberal policies, examining the JETPs and critiquing them and really putting forward a public pathway and trying to think through what that would mean, what it might mean in different regions, in different continents, different countries, et cetera. I think that whole effort, what we're doing here, is a challenge to the colonial histories that we're up against, and it is a challenge to, it is an effort to not continue those histories and find a different way forward. I think, I mean, there's so much more to understand about China and see if there are places where we can really draw from it. But there's one thought that I had as everybody was talking. The feed-in tariffs is something that in TUED we've been very critical of, and it's when you, it's part of the neoliberal policies where if you put solar panels up on your roof, for example, you get money back for the electricity that you generate. But in China, they also have feed-in tariffs. And I think instead of taking the revenue that gets generated from the feed-in tariff and individually pocketing it, that money goes to a fund that goes back into electricity infrastructure. That's my understanding of it. And so I think there's ways that we get to sort of like open up our minds and sort of rethink the things that we've been told under the kinds of agenda of profit accumulation and neoliberalism that we get to, you know, explore further. And I think it's the kind of debates that we're having here and the kind of questions that are being raised and the kinds of issues that we will be talking about in the next couple of days and onward that will be able to help develop our own thinking in terms of the alternatives in the future. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, everyone.